Hey, everybody, it's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. What's it going to take to get real action on climate change? COP26, they weren't talking about animal agriculture. In my opinion, it's impossible to fundamentally address climate change if you aren't addressing animal agriculture. But don't take it from me. Let me bring on my expert today. He's got a very long title. I will go ahead and read it. Jason, thank you for being with me today. Jason Scorse. Okay. Scorse, just simple Scorse, PhD, Associate Professor, Chair of the International Environmental Policy Program, Director of the Center for the Blue Economy, Graduate School of International Policy and Management at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Basically, what we're saying here is you know what you're talking about in terms of the environment. Thank you, Jason, for being with me.
Hey, my pleasure.
So I want to dive right into it because COP26 wasn't that long ago, and many people banging their head against the wall in aggravation saying, you know, who are you kidding? If you're not addressing animal agriculture, then you're not addressing things. And people are tired of that. Before we dive into really what we need to do, tell me about these programs, because I would love to see, you know, Gen Z and millennials head to your school. So tell me about the International Environmental Policy Program.
Sure. Well, thanks for that opportunity. So we've been around about 25 years, and we only have master's students. So it's a really nice kind of way to really focus on people who want to just work on action and advocacy. And that's why I took this job right out of grad school. It's a great program. We got a lot of good stuff going on. We're in a beautiful part of the country. We also got a lot of online options, and in this new kind of post-pandemic, or I guess end of pandemic world. But if anyone wants more info, please just reach out to me. I don't want to take your time here talking too much about it, but happy to follow up with anyone who's interested.
Okay, but what I want people to know is this is a master's program. It's a deep dive, yes, into environmental policy, which must be done on an international scale. If only one country does it, what's the point? So you teach it from a global perspective, although there's a lot of what happens in the US in terms of policy in California, but it is a global perspective. Before we dive into the type of student that you have, because I think that's very interesting. In a way, it's a very selected group. Tell us about your other job. I mean, you have like 7 jobs at the university. The Center for the Blue Economy. What is that?
Yeah, so that's it's a small kind of academic think tank hybrid that we started about a little over 10 years ago. For some private funders gave us some seed money, and now we're kind of a combination of private money and research grants. And we basically work on sustainability for the world's oceans and coasts. So everything, all the economics and finance of how we kind of create a new economy around oceans and coasts that is sustainable and just. And I can get into details of that if you'd like, but that's the overarching.
No, I sure would. No, we're here for the details. Yeah, please let it rip.
All right. Well, just to give you a flavor, I'll give you a project I've worked on the last 3 years about. So when the Green New Deal framework came out in spring of 2019, I and other of my colleagues, we read it. It was a 14-page document. It was not a detailed legislative text, but it was a 14-page framework. It barely mentioned the oceans. And so a lot of us read the writing on the wall there and said, if climate policy is moving in a serious way in the United States, the ocean community better have its priorities lined up, or we're going to get left, on the sidelines. And so we formed a national coalition on ocean climate action, and we created a set of kind of national recommendations for federal policy on how to use ocean and coastal resources to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also to help communities adapt to climate impacts. And we've been very successful. A lot of our recommendations have ended up in the Biden administration's policy. They're at all the levels. They're in his executive actions. They're also in the kind of the departments. And more importantly, a lot of our asks have made it into the Build Back Better bill, which, fingers crossed, knock on wood, whatever juju you can throw out into the ether here, is going to pass in the next couple of weeks, will be billions and billions of dollars in ocean climate policy. So that's been the real big project of ours the last few years.
Wow, that's big news. And I certainly do want that to come to fruition. Can you give us some of the details of what that money would go towards?
Sure, sure. So the money in the Build Back Better, there's $6 billion for coastal restoration. So this is, all from everything from building, marshlands and seagrasses and dunes to all kinds of natural infrastructure. There's many billions of dollars for climate smart ports. So this is kind of greening the whole ports infrastructure. This has a big deal for environmental justice because it's poor communities that live right next to ports, and there's a lot of pollution that comes from the ships and the trucks. So kind of electrifying them and greening them. And there's a lot of R&D that needs to go into greening the shipping industry. It uses the dirtiest fuel, kind of out of sight, out of mind when it's out in the ocean. We also pushed very hard for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Biden administration's already made that federal policy, and the Department of Interior Secretary Haaland is already saying they're going to lease 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2025, so ahead of schedule. So those are a flavor for the type of things that we've been advocating.
And for those of us who are slow, why is offshore wind something that you would want?
Yeah, so here's the deal on climate change. The thing for everyone to know is we need to electrify everything. Okay, we need to electrify all transportation, all heating, all water. We want to get electric stoves, not gas stoves. Everything needs to be electrified, and then that electricity needs to be carbon neutral. So it needs to come from the sun, wind, geothermal, and wind, as obviously is a big part of that. We have a very undeveloped offshore wind in the U.S., and we're way, way behind Europe and even parts of Asia. And there's just tremendous. We could power the entire United States economy on just offshore wind. We probably won't end up doing that. It'll be a mix, but that's how much wind is available. We're blessed with thousands of miles of coastline. And so it's just absolutely key to get that on the grid and get the fossil fuel off.
Okay, I want to ask a question there because I want to understand that better as well. When you say offshore, I think outside of the United States, but what are you referring to offshore?
Yeah,
it was still within our boundaries. Sorry.
It just means in the water. Okay, so it's offshore land. So it's terrestrial is onshore. Offshore just means in the water. And so this is either state or federal water. So state waters in the U.S. is up to 3 miles off the coast, and then past 3 miles is federal. So what we're advocating right now is that 3 miles plus. And that means that it's not going to mess up people's ocean views. It's going to be way in the distance. But then we need transmission lines. We need port infrastructure. It's a pretty big deal to do it.
Yeah.
But and 30 gigawatts is a lot. This is going to power, tens of millions of homes. But this is what's on the docket now.
And that's $6 billion or six. This is part of the $6 million.
So the offshore wind stuff is going to be mostly private industry money. So that was separate. There will be some public funding for helping to get the port infrastructure up and some of the transmission lines. The $6 billion is coastal restoration. So this is, restoring the coast so that natural infrastructure can help, protect our sewage lines and our roads and stuff. Instead of putting seawalls, we put dunes or grasslands or marshlands and stuff that is good for the environment and also good for climate protection.
So a personal note here, which is probably not what you're thinking, but I will share my 2 cents. I split my time in Chicago and Los Angeles. And in Chicago, so Midwest, you've got prairie grasslands.
Yep.
They've started this belt, for lack of a better expression, along all the beaches, Chicago on Lake Michigan, along all the beaches. I want to say it's maybe 4 feet deep of prairie grasslands. And I always thought, I wonder why they're doing that. And would that be to shore up so that they don't, there's not an ocean, obviously, I get this. Maybe it's just for, I don't know, maybe it's for birds or other things, but is that sort of what's going on there?
Well, I don't know the specifics about, what you're referring to in Chicago, but it very likely is, right? There's all kinds of efforts to use natural infrastructure, green infrastructure to shore up coast. And it doesn't just have to be, ocean. It can be Great Lakes or, or other kind of river estuarine systems. And this is stuff that, there's a lot more science coming out right now. And it's really the way to go. And sometimes it's hybrid. Sometimes you need some hardened stuff with the natural stuff. It depends. But definitely more of the green is what we need.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fascinating. And I want to say I'm very pleased to see that made it into the Build Back Better plan. Sometimes I don't always feel that politicians are on board, but of course I'm not as close to it as you are. What are some of the other political initiatives? Because if there are others. I mean, not like this isn't a big enough one in and of its own right, but it seems that that's really the thrust of the program, the IEP, the International Environmental Policy Program, is a lot about policy, so government work. Yes.
Yeah, so let me be clear here. We take a pretty broad view of policy. So we include private sector, corporate sustainability, even institutional, like an education institution has policy and has a lot of environmental impact in terms of their procurement, their events, how they, manage their infrastructure. So we take a pretty broad view of policy. But yes, I'd say, half to 2/3 of what we do is focused on government policy. And a key point I want to make with this is, look, America's a big country, and obviously it's a much bigger world. There's a lot of complicated stuff here. What's incumbent on us as citizens is to differentiate good politicians from bad politicians, good policy from bad policy. It's what really bothers me in the American context in particular is the laziness. It's just, politicians are corrupt. It's just political. It's just that. No, it's not. There are really good politicians that are like dedicated public servants that are working day and night on really complex stuff. And then there are performative lunatics who are trying to burn everything down. We as citizens need to know the difference. And we need to support the ones doing the good and fight against the ones doing the bad and not lump all politics into kind of a generic. That's what they want, by the way. The status quo wants us to hate politics and think it's all corrupt so we don't pay attention. And then the status quo can continue to pillage and take everything and destroy the ecosystems, right? So I just want to be clear. It's very, very important to know the good actors.
This is why I asked you to be on this show, because I didn't want to mince words and I wanted people to know exactly what they can do. And I love your forthright way of speaking. Would you care to say who are the politicians that you really feel are doing a good job?
Sure. Well, we'll first start, and I'm going to say this as directly as possible. The Republican Party is an existential threat to the United States and to the world. They are an anti-democratic, authoritarian cult, and it is extremely, extremely destructive. Defeating Republicans must be the top of the agenda item. On the Democratic side, not all, most Democratic legislators in the U.S. Congress are very good on most environmental issues. Again, most, not all. We have Joe Manchin there in West Virginia, who's a big coal and oil guy, who's kind of putting brakes on some of the Democratic stuff. But even he so far has supported a lot of pretty progressive stuff. So the worst on the Democratic side is better than the best on the Republican side.
I won't put words in your mouth. It, to me, comes close to environmental terrorism. That's sort of what we're saying, that people could hijack our system.
Well, I just mean when you have a political party that is not only authoritarian and anti-democratic, but then is also in bed with the fossil fuel industry and willing to do anything to protect fossil fuel interests at a time of climate emergency, that's about as existential as you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that you say we are at an existential crisis. I talk about this all the time. Like if you're not on board with change now, just throw your kids under a bus. I mean, what are you waiting for? If it's not now, when? So very fascinating. And you've been pleased with what Biden's doing. That's great. Now, do you have fears that if Biden's not around in 3 or 4 years, this all gets overturned? Or how structurally formative would this be?
Well, first of all, we have to pass the Build Back Better bill.
Right, sure, of course, yeah.
Passes, that has about $550 billion of investment in climate policy over a decade. So that will be by far the biggest investment the U.S. has ever made. And given U.S.'s stature in the world economy, really would make us second to China, the EU, if you include all the countries, maybe. But it puts us for the first time in the big, investment category. It's not the best policy because, again, the Joe Manchin in West Virginia has taken out some of the really good stuff. But it would be a tremendous, huge win. And again, because it's for 10 years, a lot of that would be likely hard to reverse completely if Biden is defeated in 2024. But look, the reality is, unfortunately, I wish it wasn't the case. Every election in the U.S. is existential at this point until either the Republican Party is thoroughly defeated and reconstituted as something else, or they reform and become a sane center-right party, which is totally fine. I have nothing wrong with conservatism. They're not a conservative party. They're an authoritarian cult. They're not a conservative party. And so, yes, I'm very worried that if Biden loses in 2024, a lot of this can be reversed, but not all of it. A lot of it will be, the momentum will be there, and it won't be fully reversible. But yes, I am worried. And that's why after this passes, I'm going to work on his reelection.
I like where you place your priorities, but ultimately environmental spending is a political issue. And if you're not going to align yourselves, this is sort of the single issue vote. I would think that people would be placing, sometimes people do abortion or other things. And I would think that, again, the future of your kids would have to be the single issue voting. And we're not really looking at a positive future if we don't do dramatic change. So you're talking about the Build Back Better plan. And I think you said over 10 years, $550 billion would be spent. This would be a momentous occasion. Is it enough? Can we really reverse climate change? I talked to so many environmentalists and they almost throw in the towel. From all of them, they seem very despondent.
Yeah, look, I don't look at this as a binary. There is never going to be a time where we declare victory, right? Maybe a couple hundred years from now, but that's not in our lifetimes. There is going to be, and this is why we need smart, dedicated, strategic people with a long-term view, because there is no win, right? All there is right now is really damage control and getting us to a place where it's, the worst risks are mitigated, right? So the point here is, we're talking about 1.5 degree warming is the goal of the Paris Agreement, right? And that's the maximum we want to, right? Well, you know what? If it's 1.6, does that mean we failed? Well, 1.6 is better than 1.7, And my point is, this is going to be a matter of degrees, literally. And, every tenth of a degree, every half a degree centigrade that we go, higher means probably hundreds of millions of people dead, probably, huge swaths of the world unlivable, major ecosystems destroyed. So it's just it isn't a binary. And so I just don't think about it this way. And also, as we started this podcast, this broadcast with, it's like, what else is there to do, right? I have a kid, I have a family, like I can't be despondent. I don't have the luxury of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you say that, really making it life and death. You who has a new 3-month-old, congratulations to you. Okay. So we talk about this, no time to waste, can't fool around. Like if you're not doing this, then, what the heck are you doing? This has to be priority number one. So I love that you're talking about politics and Biden, but I was disappointed with the choice of Tom Vilsack. And I wondered how you feel about Biden not addressing animal agriculture. Is it just a series of steps? He can't take it on first. He has to take on other things before he can take on animal agriculture? Or do you think he will just kowtow, if that's the word, to the lobbyists?
Well, it's funny you point out Vilsack. He was one of the weaker of the cabinet heads, in my view, too. I was not super happy with that. But look, here's my thinking on this. Animal agriculture and animal diets is so ingrained culturally in America that it is very close to impossible for a politician to tackle it head on. And so I do not expect Biden to do that. And the interesting thing about the kind of the alternatives to the factory farming industrial meat system that are going on really at the private sector. And so I do think this is going to be one issue that government policy can help. And I can talk about some pretty progressive things that are going on through government, but it's mostly going to come, I think, from civil society and the private sector, not government. I wish it wasn't the case, but I think it's just too culturally ingrained for people to take it head on.
I actually think that it's not just that, although it certainly is. It's also the timing of things. I just think that they didn't feel that they could tell people and still be elected ever. Okay, it's COVID. Oh, and by the way, your life is upside down. You maybe don't have a job. You can't leave your house. Oh, and now we're coming for your food, which we're not. Of course, there's such a plethora of things to eat on a plant-based vegan diet, but people might perceive it that way. And I just didn't think they felt that they could control crowds, that it might be just sheer pandemonium. So maybe too much to take off all at once. That said, in my opinion, you are not actually addressing climate change if you don't address animal agriculture. So very disappointed in the Tom Vilsack appointment. But as we talk about private sector coming in, there is a very private sector really robust, pretty much, I'll say. Just quick stat. So between 2010 and 2019, there was about 3 billion invested from the private sector in alt proteins. In 2020, it was 3.1. So more than all 10 years previous. And then now the first 3 quarters of 2022 has beaten 2021. So the public has gotten the memo, and they're doing private investment. But the government did make a $10 million grant, I believe, to Tufts University for the nation's first cellular agriculture, otherwise known as cultivated meat, center. So that was something, although really small.
Yeah, it was. That was one of the positive things I was going to highlight as well. You're right. It's very small, but remember, things start small, right? That's where it starts. And that's a big deal, right? The U.S. putting USDA money into, cultivated meat is a big signal. It's a big signal to private investors. It's a signal to the regulators that this stuff is coming. We better get the rules in place so that this can go to market quickly. We got to get the inspectors. We got to get the whole infrastructure ready. So I think more money will be coming, and I think it's a big sea change that's going to be happening soon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that, because I didn't say it and you did. Big note that it comes from USDA budget. To me, that is a big signal. So thank you for that. What else is going on that is positive in this direction?
Well, I think it's good that you mentioned cultivated meat, because I think, as somebody, again, over 30-year vegan here, who has no desire to eat meat, and even if the ethical concerns are mitigated by cultivated meat, which is just still not of interest to me. I think this is the biggest game changer, though, in terms of getting the masses off of factory farmed industrial meat. And so I'm all for the plant-based stuff. I'm loving, Beyond Burger and Impossible, and I'm loving all that stuff. But I think the cultivated meat is really where the action is going to be. And it's great to see governments around the world, Israel, Singapore, really being bullish on this. China's putting money into this. Now the U.S., I'm sure the EU is not too far along. This could be the stuff that really changes things. Because again, it's one thing to get someone to eat a Beyond Burger, and most people who are meat eaters who eat them like them. But it's another to have literally identical meat that's cleaner, because it doesn't have the antibiotics, it doesn't, if it's fish and seafood, doesn't have mercury, doesn't have microplastics. It has no animal slaughter. It's, and it can be grown in, very clean, sterile conditions. Why would anyone eat an animal from a slaughterhouse after that, or a wild tuna from the ocean? And so I think this is where I'm the most bullish. Is now, again, it's still years, maybe decades away to be at scale. But, as someone who's followed solar industry for the last 20 years, no one predicted solar would be as cheap as it is today, and as dominant. And I think that's where cultivated meat is going.
Yeah, I think cultivated meat also using much less water, much less land. And with factory farms, you always have that risk of pandemics. We're living through one now. So you think of Asian bird flu, African swine fever, Ebola, mad cow disease. These are all animal-borne illnesses, COVID, AIDS. So you take out that, as well as the antibiotics, hormones, obviously animal cruelty, much cleaner, no traces of feces running around in your food, which is what you currently have now with factory farms, and much more efficient, using less land and less water. I always think, this is why to me it's a little disappointed. You mentioned China getting in. Of course they're getting in. They've got 1.4 billion people to feed. And you can't be strong in trade talks if the person you're negotiating with, the entity you're negotiating with, controls your food supply. So the person the country that controls the food controls the power. This is why I'm surprised that governments aren't getting in faster, because wars are going to be fought over food and water. That's how I see it. What do you think about that?
Well, I to some extent, I agree. Although, if we look at what wars have been fought in the last 20 years, it doesn't necessarily map onto that perfectly, right? The whole terrorism madness that engulfed us for the last 2 decades. But putting that aside, remember, though, the one thing about this technology is this stuff, a lot of this information comes into the public domain, right? If China, for example, one of the reasons solar panels are so cheap is because China invested so much money in their development, and then the world price crashed, and that's to our benefit. Now, it didn't. Our solar manufacturers aren't happy about it, but for buying a solar panel for your house, you should be thanking China, right? Because it's much cheaper, and it's cheaper for Nigeria and for Guatemala. I see it the same with food. I'm not so worried that China is going to, patent everything and control the food supply. I think if they want to put billions into it and create all these new technologies that then lower the price for the whole world and speed the adoption, that's probably on net a good thing.
I agree. A good thing. But, hard to, now the roles would be reversed. Right now, we export a lot of food to China. If we're importing a lot of food from China, the political power that you have ultimately there is a lot less, which is why I would like to see politicians, or I would expect politicians to be more on top of this. But I'm all for China spending. I'm all for it. And as you say, Israel and Singapore and a little bit here in the US, but it's mostly private money. Okay, well, since we're on this list, we exchanged a list of questions before the show. We're totally throwing that out the window. But since we're on really better topics, in my opinion, let's talk about land animals first. And if you could share with everyone, or I can start the list, but if you could either finish the list or start the list of all the reasons why, if we don't address animal agriculture, we can't really address climate change in full.
Right. Well, I mean, obviously, the energy one is the first. There's disputes about the exact greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture because it depends, how far do you build this concentric circle? You do all the transportation and all the pesticides and all the refrigeration, but it's
deforestation.
Right, the deforestation, which then releases the greenhouse gases. Right, so if you do it in a comprehensive way, it's at least in the 15 to 20% range, right? Which is just a tremendous amount. It's like the entire transportation sector. So you're absolutely right that if we were to electrify everything, as I started this out with, and it was all solar and wind, and yet maintain the exact identical food system, we would not meet the 1.5 degree target for Paris, right? It's just not possible with all the emissions coming from the animal agricultural system. So that's just part one. Part two is, why do we care about the climate emergency, right? We care about it because it's, it makes the earth uninhabitable, right? It destroys biodiversity. It's polluting, and it creates huge heat waves. It creates incredible kind of oscillations in storms and precipitation. A lot of that comes from animal agriculture, right? We get tremendous water pollution. We get the dead zones from all the fertilizer feeding animals and all their waste going out into waterways, especially during storms, and creating these huge dead zones in the oceans. We get, again, as you mentioned, the deforestation. As you also mentioned, we get the pandemic spread, right? This is with COVID now becoming much more to the fore. So, we could have, we could electrify everything and have green power, and then animals spreading massive plagues across the planet every decade. That's not a sustainable livelihood. So even though they don't map one-to-one to the climate emergency, they map very closely, and they add some extra dimensions because, again, pandemics compared to climate change, that's kind of in the same category.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with climate change comes the fact that we have less arable land at our fingertips. So right now we have about 50% of the globe, if I understand it correctly, we use to grow our food. Of that 50%, 75% of that land goes to animal agriculture. Now we have a growing population. We have climate change, which is shrinking our arable land possibilities. You're just not going to be able to feed people. So we talked about, we said the words environmental justice, but we haven't even talked about food security. So it's not even an efficient enough system to provide food for the number of people on the planet with the resources we have, because we're getting more people, but you're not getting more land and you're not getting more water. In fact, you're getting less.
Yeah. And I just want to kind of parse a couple things you just said. And this comes back to a pet peeve of mine with when I hear general commentary, not your commentary, but general.
Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, it's not you, but it speaks to this larger issue of, feed the world, right? The question should always be feed the world what, right? And so, and as you mentioned, the current system is incredibly inefficient, right? It's just basic ecology. Every trophic level you go up, you lose 90% of the efficiency. So if you grow plants, feed them to animals, and then harvest animals, you lose 90% of the energy. And so that means for every pound of animal protein, you could have created up to 10 pounds of plant protein. So just right there, it's an order of magnitude. So any system that we're talking about that's, meat-based, that's feeding 8 billion, could feed 80 billion, right? If it was a plant-based system. And so this is the key thing. It's not the quantity of food, it's the type of food. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, is that the industrial animal agricultural system is the most inefficient system for converting energy to calories and protein that humanity could possibly devise.
Right. So any business person would say, well, I don't want to do that math. That, and particularly as the cost for my resources go up, they require a lot of land and water. Those things are becoming very scarce. My bottom line goes up. That's why I think you're starting to see industry get into that. But you talked about we're trying to feed 8 billion people, but we could be feeding 80 with what we give to animals. So ultimately what you're sort of saying in like a sound bite, if I'm getting this right, you can correct me if not, we're spending all this land and water to feed animals, not to feed people. We feed 10 times more animals. There's 80 billion animals slaughtered a year for 8 billion people. We feed 10 times more animals than we feed people. All of our resources are going to feed animals, not to feed people. Sorry. Yes. Does that make sense, everybody?
It does. Yeah. And it's about, like you said, it's 2/3, 3/4 of all the grains produced in the world is to feed animals, not to feed humans.
And what's so crazy about that is grains. They have fiber, they have protein. Are we giving that to people? No, we're giving it to animals. Okay, so not making a whole heck of a lot of sense. And when the time is right, I think politicians will have to get on board with that, I'm hoping. But maybe let's switch from land to water. Now, when I think of the state of our oceans, I interviewed National Geographic photographer Paul Nicklin a while back. I don't know if you know him or that means anything to you, but, you know, very much an environmentalist. And when I interviewed him, oh gosh, I want to say it was in like 2014, he said, Elizabeth, our oceans are maxed out 7 times over capacity. I'm sure that number has now changed. And what he meant is the oceans are the lifeblood of the planet. I don't want to speak like I'm an expert here. I am not. This is my layperson's understanding. So Jason's going to hop in and correct me if I got this wrong. And the oceans just can't carry us anymore with the way that we are taxing them. And I wonder if you could talk about the state of our oceans, that list that would apply to water, just like we did for land, of the environmental inefficiencies there and what we can do about it.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't have the exact kind of number in terms of carrying capacity that you just referred to here, but we know for a fact that, you know, despite more and more boats, more and more fishing gear, the amount of wild fish that we're getting from the oceans has peaked or is declining in many places. And in fact, most of the seafood now that people are getting is from aquaculture. It's not even from wild fish because we have depleted the oceans and maxed them out so much. Now, to be fair, there are some fisheries and some, you know, regions and nations that are reasonably well managed. And I say reasonably because even what many people call sustainable, I think are very problematic in many ways, but I would say reasonably well managed. And then the high seas is just a real free-for-all, full-on destruction where, you know, the highest trophic level species are just being decimated, whether it's sharks or tunas or swordfish. And so it's a complete and utter catastrophe, really. It's ecocide is the way I like to call it. Unfortunately, in the marine policy community, most of the kind of effort is, can we make industrial fishing better instead of alternatives to industrial fishing? Yeah. And I get some of that. If you've been grown up in a kind of fishing management regime mentality, you just kind of keep wanting to focus on that. But again, I think both the cultivated seafood and plant-based alternatives, and also aquaculture, but on kind of sea vegetables and maybe shellfish, something lower trophic level, not your finfish, not your salmon and your tuna. I think that's the way forward in terms of food from the oceans.
And do I have this right that things like kelp and mussels and oysters, now some people would say, oh, I don't eat mussels and oysters because they're living beings, but I'll include them for this conversation, actually pull carbon from the air and help me here. Don't they act as a filter?
Yeah, carbon kind of sinks or
yes,
sequestration.
Thank you.
Yes, they do. Now, remember, when you eat those animals or use them, you often release a lot of that carbon.
Oh, so, is that right?
Yeah, the key point here is, though, they might not be fully carbon neutral, but they are much, much less carbon intensive, and they can be carbon neutral. I mean, if it's done right, I have a colleague who here in Central California has a seaweed business. He takes water out of the Monterey Bay. They feed it to sea vegetables and abalone. They have some very, very low energy pumps that circulate the water. The water goes back into the bay cleaner than when it was siphoned out. They grow, huge quantities for fancy restaurants, a lot of really high quality food and protein, and it's very, very low carbon. It's not neutral, but it's very low.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so we're talking about this state of our oceans, kind of getting back to our original talk, and that you're just saying it's ecocide at this point. It's to me, it feels like when you tell this story about it's just sort of piracy on the open seas, and I don't know how you control that politically. Back to what you do at your school, there seems to be sort of no man's land happening out there. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. Well, some of my colleagues are working very hard to get a moratorium on fishing in the high seas. And the UN has been working on this, basically a high seas treaty. It is obviously very, very hard to do. It's been going on for years, if not decades. And the fate is unknown, if not a moratorium or a ban, at least severe restrictions. But the reality is most fishing grounds, apart from the high seas, are within areas of national jurisdiction, and it's not an international issue, right? It's individual countries have to make those decisions. Give you an example in the U.S., some of you might have seen this article. There's, the right whale, critically endangered. There's only about 350 of them left in the wild. This is down from 500 only, a few years back. And one of these white whales just gave birth to a calf just a few days ago or a week or two ago. And this is, a huge thing. One baby. Right. This right whale mom has got broken out of fishing gear 7 times. Her whole body is crisscrossed with fishing gear scars. And amazing. She has propeller scars from getting hit by boats. So we are just, these are critically endangered whales. And again, ghost fishing gear just left off of boats. It's entangling these whales. This is what kills a lot of whales. It's not, it's not harpoons. It's literally fishing nets left adrift in the water that they get entangled with and kill them. And the fact that in the United States, with an endangered species of this magnitude, we're still letting this stuff happen, and we don't have severe criminal penalties for people who engage in this is just really unfathomable. It's ecocide.
Outrage. I just don't know what to say. I'm so outraged. But I will try to bring it back to what the listeners can relate to. So some people might say, so what if we lose whales? I wonder if you'd like to comment on that, and then I will comment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough issue, right? We can go kind of an instrumental value and talk about the value that whales bring to us, whether it's whale watching or scientific discoveries, et cetera, right? There's also a lot that whales do that's showing that they sequester carbon, that whales. And so if you have a value for carbon, if we had the whales we did 200 years ago before industrial whaling, when we had millions more whales, they would probably sequester huge amounts of carbon. That's an instrumental view. We can make that view. I don't know how ultimately compelling it is to people. My view is much more the moral view. Right? These are deeply sentient beings. These are animals that communicate over thousands of miles, that are advanced mammals. They think, they feel, they play. They have very advanced social networks, right? These are our kin. I want to just make one little tangent here. The biggest lie that we are told from the day we are born, before we're even born, is that there are humans and there are animals. That is a lie. That is unscientific. It is wrong. We are all animals. The whale is your cousin. It is your brother. It is your sister, right? It is part of your family heritage. And we have to get past the speciesism mindset that somehow humans are separate, apart, and superior. And to me, the fact that we would threaten something as sentient and advanced and has lived for hundreds of millions of years on this planet peacefully until we came around, right? Nothing would kill these right whales if it wasn't our harpoons, our ship propellers, and our nets, right? Without humans, these would be living in a life of abundance, and that we would threaten them. So what? We can eat a crab cake or, a fish fillet at McDonald's. I mean, morally, that is such an abomination to me that I think that's the argument that I don't know if it's enough to sway people, but that's where I come down.
Yeah, that's where I come down, and I'll just say outrage. I won't repeat what you said because you said it, and I'm outraged with you. But again, trying to bring it back to the listener, when people damage your planet, and make no mistake, when you render a species extinct like whales, the ecosystem that is in the ocean changes. And as the oceans die, you don't need to listen to me. Go to Italy and see how they're fishing off the coast of Italy. They're not catching anything anymore because the oceans are already dead. Just like Jason told you, we don't have wild fish like we used to. When that ecosystem goes, so goes your world. So when you think that other people are, this is how I think, when you think that other people are taking your future, your kids' future, when people, I'm switching back to land animals, but when we deforest and cut down trees so that we can feed animals, not even feeding people because you're going grains and then you give it to animals. I think, hey, man, that's my air you're messing with, because trees don't just pull in carbon, they let out oxygen. And I think you're taking my air, and people are taking your oceans. And so those whales, a big part of your ocean. If you don't defend your ocean, no one's going to do it. And it's not going to be the planet your kids can inhabit. Outrage. That's all I can say. Outrage. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jason. Do I have that logic wrong?
No, I mean, I think that logic is correct. The only thing that the nuance that a lot of environmentalists don't like talking about is like, look, there are lots of species that have gone extinct and that are going extinct and will go extinct and have gone extinct in Earth's history. And the reality is that, how much of them we absolutely need to eat or for medicine, it's a fraction of it. It's not the entire thing. And so absolutely, if the right whales go extinct, there is going to be economic and societal impacts and impacts to the ecosystem that affect us. But some animals, it won't affect us that much. And the question is then, is there a moral rationale? And I think ultimately we have to rise above the direct self-interest. And it has to be now, maybe this is going to be not enough critical mass of people to have that moral calculus that's a little beyond just what's good for humans and what's good for me. But I feel like if we as a species can't get out of that, we probably aren't going to be around that much longer.
Agreed. And
And to be honest, I don't think we would deserve to be around that much longer.
I was going to say that as well.
I'm going to throw that right out. If we continue on this earth thinking we are the only species of value and we have a right to do whatever we want, no matter how painful and cruel and abominable to other species, we do not deserve to continue.
Mm-hmm. We're the parasite that the planet is trying to get rid of. That's when you think of.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, the point is that we don't have to be a parasite. If we choose to be a parasite, then we deserve our fate. But we don't. I would prefer us to choose to be a regenerative, creative force on this planet that can help, maximize life on this planet, not diminish it.
So let's talk about that. What will it take to be a regenerative society? Is it as simple as the wind we talked about in the beginning? What's it going to take on every level?
Well, let's go to the food system. And I think if we move away from the industrial animal agricultural system, since most of that land is used to feed animals. And so if we're eating plants directly or cultivated meat that's going to be much more efficient, we can rewild the world. We can go to E.O. Wilson's, half for the planet. That's the vision people always say, environmentalists, what do you say yes to? You always say no, no, no. Well, here's what I say yes to. I say yes to a world where we give back 50% of all land and ocean to other species besides humans. We connect all the habitats up and down, east and west, so that animals have free reign to migrate. So we increase biodiversity and save and preserve everything that exists now and let them flourish. We have super highly efficient cities, all on renewable energy. And we have a very creative, regenerative kind of economy in which all of us can step out of the cities and basically go into a safari, 100 miles outside of any city is going to be a rewilded landscape full of all kinds of wild creatures that we can, interact with. So we don't have to, if we're in the United States, we don't have to go to Alaska. We don't have to go to the Serengeti. We can rewild the whole planet and then live sustainably in cities that are redesigned.
Devil's advocate, is that feasible with a growing population going from 7.8 to about 9.8, according to the UN by 2050?
Absolutely. I mean, there's tons of land, and cities don't necessarily have to have a huge footprint, right? You can put millions and millions of people in a relatively small amount. I mean, just think about the United States. You have probably, flown across the United States a number of times. When you look out the window, it's pretty empty, right? You're at night and flying around. There's not a lot of light. I mean, when you get to cities, there's a lot of light, but it's a lot of darkness and a lot of open space, right? And that's with 330 million. So if we had 500 million, in the US, we'd still be plenty of space. And especially if all that farmland was created back to wilderness. So I think it's absolutely, the math is pretty clear that this is doable.
Yeah, and I love that you say that. People often ask me, well, what about fishermen and what about farmers? What about ranchers? You're putting them out of business. And I always say, well, no, the ranchers have that land. They're sitting on the golden, ticket. They can repopulate that land, not with animals for slaughter, but with trees. And then they're, renting back carbon sequester. They're farming, carbon sequestering, if you will, for lack of a better expression. So I don't think it has to be at the sacrifice of a certain part of the economy, of a certain jobs of the economy. I don't think it has to be. I think it could be quite beneficial in terms of job growth.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And also, just as I started this conversation about differentiating good politicians from bad politicians, let's differentiate good ranchers from bad ranchers, good fishermen from bad fishermen. Bad fishermen, yes, let's put them out of business. The ones who are killing whales and jumping their gear in the water and doing, unsustainable fishing and killing shark finning. Yes, I want to put them out of business. The ranchers who are shooting wolves and poisoning wildlife. Yeah. Yes, put them out of business. The sustainable rancher who's doing wild pasture grazing and respecting wildlife, let's find new employment for them. The local sustainable fishery that's managing everything well, not killing the sea turtles, being respectful of not letting their gear get into the water. Let's find them, in aquaculture and shellfish. But again, let's differentiate the good from the bad. And the bad, we should absolutely all be in agreement. Let's get rid of the bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Again, just a personal story. I was in the Philippines, very far off. Philippines, a country of 7,000 islands, very far away from Manila, just on a little desert island. We had rented a hut. It was wonderful. You would hear bombing going on all the time. They were bombing their own coral because rather than fish for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fish, they could bomb the coral and get 100 fish, 200 fish at a time. But then that coral's dead forever. So, it's not far from ecocide, folks. That's what he's talking about, this kind of terrorism that can happen at high seas. So much to talk about. Do we have anything to be happy about? Could we, what are your predictions here going forward for the next, let's say, 3 years?
Look, I mean, first of all, I don't have the crystal ball. I'll say this though. I'll say this with certainty. The plant-based space is going to be growing exponentially. The cultivated meat space is going to be growing exponentially. Renewable energy is growing exponentially. That I can say without, with 100% certainty. In terms of, hopefulness, look, we have a solid Democratic administration committed to good environmental policy. Let's get them reelected. Right? Let's get the Build Back Better passed. Let's get Biden reelected. Let's have 8 years of strong environmental leadership before we even think about reverting back to the madness, right? So I think, look, let's take bite-sized pieces of what we can do here and think long-term strategy. I'm old enough to remember when gay marriage was unthinkable, and now it's the law of the land. I'm old enough to remember when people got put in jail for smoking a joint, and now it's legal and you're selling it on the streets, and grandmas and grandpas have their bongs out, okay? So big change is possible. It's not overnight, right? These things take time, but they can happen a lot quicker than people think. And I think the plant-based revolution, the cultivated meat revolution is coming. And if we're all lucky, knock on wood, in another generation, the factory farming, world will be a thing of the past.
I love what you say. I was disappointed by COP26. We've talked about politics and why that might be, but I remain hopeful like you. I think it's funny you say you remember back when. I mean, I remember when people used to roll down their window and throw out whatever they wanted to out of their car. Well, you're rolling it down, so that tells you how long ago it was.
Yeah.
And they'd move right on.
Yeah.
If you saw somebody litter today, you'd be like after them at a high-speed chase, getting them to go pick up their wrapper. I remember when no one wore their seatbelt, and they used to sort of make fun of people who did, because it was like, oh, you big fat baby. I also remember when you could walk into a plane and people would be smoking. So,
Absolutely. Me too.
change is possible. And we believe in change, but I'm also not here to be happy all the time, which is sort of a surprise perhaps for my listeners, because I'm pretty high energy, but enough is enough. At some point, flip and get it together, people. How much time are we going to waste? So, I am positive, but time is now, and I want to see action. I want to see action. And your story about whales outrages me. As we kind of wrap up here today, I wonder if you could talk about some more esoteric questions. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
10 years ago. I wish I knew about the connection of pandemics to animal agriculture. Obviously that was something I had kind of known but I've been giving talks and teaching about this stuff, and pandemics had never really made my radar as part of the reason to move away. And now, obviously, with COVID, it likely coming from that wet market in China, and then realizing, wait, all the other pandemics, almost all of them have come from animals. So that missing piece, I think, I wish I had known, because I would have been sounding the alarm on that a lot earlier.
Yeah, and I will say to that again, this land is your land. This land is my land. If you're not fighting for your own planet, folks, I'm sorry, you're asleep at the wheel. People were talking about the connection between animal agriculture and pandemics, and nobody listened. So that is not new information. You and I maybe didn't have it on our radars, but many did, and they sounded the alarms to politicians and, Center for Disease Control, et cetera. So, time to use your voice, folks, and combine it with your purchasing power and your vote every 4 years and 2 years, because it's your planet. You either fight for it or you're, going the way of Darwin. Okay. You are a 30+ year vegan. What made you go vegan?
It's funny. I wish I could point to one kind of catalytic moment, but it was just a kind of transition. I think just got more into kind of environmental causes, and I was in Santa Cruz, and John Robbins, who, wrote the book Diet for New America, was here. I saw him talk a bunch. I read his book. I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, and it just all kind of came together. And I realized, this is wrong. And I was a hardcore meat eater. I was not raised vegetarian at all. I ate pepperoni and roast beef and hot dogs growing up in New York City. And so it was a big transition for me, but the best thing I ever did.
So you're obviously very passionate, very committed. You said right out of graduate school, you went to work for Middlebury, and basically you've stayed, again, so committed. You are passionate about what you do. And how has working in an industry that you love and fighting for change impacted your life?
Well, I'm just incredibly privileged. Being able to get a graduate degree from Berkeley and then get an academic job. It's not the highest paying gig in the world. With a PhD in economics, I could go work for consultants and make a lot more money. But I don't know. I think that's one thing I'm very happy my parents taught me. Like, hey, what you do for work you're going to spend more time at work than a lot of time with your family. All right. And so make sure you like it. Money is good, have enough money to pay your bills, but it's much more important to like what you do. And so I always put a premium on that. I've gotten to travel the world, working with people internationally. It's been a I just feel very privileged. And, that's why I like being a professor. I like being able to get money for students and help them start their careers. And, just give thanks for knowledge and being a part of a group of people that's, trying to make a new template for, human civilization here, because we have to do better, right? We are the horror show right now, and I'd like us to not be that.
Yeah, we have to do better now. I love what you say about working in an area that you're passionate about and what your mom taught you. I always feel like it's the bingo effect. When your passion meets your skill set, you are the big winner. So, I mean, that seems to be evident in your own life. Okay, a couple of super fast exit questions. You are running around, meeting people all over the place, giving lectures and talks, and very engaged. You missed lunch. What's your go-to snack?
Go-to snack. I like the jerkies, the plant-based jerkies. I kind of like that as a go-to snack.
My go-to jerky is it's jerky, y'all. They've got a salt and pepper. Have you had some?
I have not had that brand.
I'll send you some. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's coming your way. And then my very last question for you. You have a lot of positive news, but you also face not positive news every day. Is there a phrase that you say to yourself to get yourself back in the game?
Yeah, there is. It's embrace entropy, savor serenity. And the point there is that the world's has a lot of chaos, and it always has. If anything, in our modern society, we've been able to minimize it to some extent with having running water and lights, and we have most things working most of the time. But the world is a chaotic place. So when entropy comes your way, embrace it. Like, it's going to teach you something. It's going to build resilience. And then savor serenity when you get it, because it's precious, and that's the recharge.
Yeah, precious and fleeting. And I would say that, yeah, maybe we've got running water and electricity, but of late, it's been feeling like the world is falling apart at the seams. So you might as well run with it. I have loved having you with me today. I hope that you will come back. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so grateful that you have dropped this knowledge on all of my listeners here today. You can find out more, everybody. Hopefully, we were running a tad bit late, so I want to make sure that I've gotten this website right. If people wanted to find out more about the programs that you have at Middlebury, can I just send people to middlebury.edu? That's middlebury.edu.
Yeah, and I mean, you could even do it simpler as miis.edu. So that's the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, miis.edu, and you'll see the environmental policy program on there.
miis.edu. Jason Scorse, I want to thank you for being with me. Thank you for all you do. I'm going to track you down and make you come back. This has been so wonderful to me. I'm so glad that you are fighting on our side. Not that it's a side thing, but fighting for a better planet for all on the planet. We didn't even get to really talk about environmental justice and that. So you will have to come back. You don't go away. Everybody else on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. I will see you next week. Hope you're having a good holiday season, and thanks for being vegan. Jason, stay put.